Brendan lay in bed, his body restless, heart racing as warmth coursed through his skin, while his mind was consumed by thoughts he couldn't control. It had been weeks since nights had become increasingly difficult, not from common insomnia, but from something he knew he shouldn't feel. The desire that consumed him had a name: Edward, his stepbrother. Just thinking about Edward, Brendan felt his body react. He tried to push the image out of his mind, but the more he fought it, the more vivid it became. He couldn't ignore the way Edward walked around the house, his muscles outlined under his pale skin, his carefree smile making Brendan feel things he never should. The excitement surged with every memory of Edward's body, and the heat rising in Brendan's skin only worsened the situation. Brendan bit his lip, trying to maintain control, but his mind kept wandering to places he knew were forbidden. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined Edward, his body, the closeness, the touch he craved more than anything, and more, his body responded to that growing desire. Restless, he turned over in bed, his body burning with excitement. He knew he shouldn't feel this way about Edward, but he couldn't stop. There was something irresistible about that desire, something pulling him toward his stepbrother, despite every rational part of his mind screaming to stop. Tonight, Brendan knew he couldn't continue ignoring what he felt. Unable to control himself, he slipped out of bed, his bare feet moving soundlessly across the floor as he walked toward Edward's room. Each step seemed to increase the heat flowing through his veins, and the desire grew with every moment. As he reached the door, Brendan hesitated for a moment. He knew that crossing that line would be something he could never undo, but the pull to be near Edward was stronger. He opened the door slowly, his eyes immediately falling on Edward lying in bed, his body partially covered by the blanket. The soft moonlight illuminated the room, highlighting the contours of his body. Brendan's stomach churned with a mix of nerves and excitement. It was impossible to look away. He imagined what it would be like to touch Edward, to feel the warmth of his skin beneath his fingers, and just the thought made his body respond. Brendan approached the bed, unable to resist the pull. The desire he had been suppressing was now on the surface, undeniable. He knew that nothing would be the same after tonight. Brendan's heart raced faster as he got closer to the bed. Edward's room was wrapped in an almost complete silence, except for the soft sound of his steady breathing. Every step Brendan took seemed to drag him closer to a point of no return. What was he doing? Even as that question echoed in his mind, his body seemed to move on its own, guided by a desire he could no longer suppress. Edward slept soundly, unaware of the storm brewing inside Brendan. The blanket had slipped slightly, revealing part of his skin under the moonlight. Brendan felt his stomach twist again, a combination of anxiety and excitement growing inside him. His eyes traced the lines of Edward's body, as if mapping out the areas he longed to explore. Brendan knelt beside the bed, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from Edward's body. He hesitated for a moment, battling the impulse to reach out and touch his brother. He knew it was wrong. But at the same time, the proximity of Edward stirred something so powerful that resisting it seemed impossible. Memories of his nighttime fantasies flooded back, more vivid now that he was standing just inches away. Slowly, Brendan extended his hand, his fingers trembling with anticipation. He knew that if he took the next step, there would be no going back, but the temptation was overwhelming. His fingers hovered in the air for a moment, hesitant, before finally making contact with Edward's skin. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a wave of electricity through Brendan's entire body. Brendan's heart pounded in his chest. Feeling Edward's warm skin under his hand ignited a fire inside him. The desire was palpable, and Brendan knew he couldn't hide what he felt anymore. He leaned in closer, his lips hovering just above Edward's bare shoulder. Brendan's breath was shaky, and he could feel each rapid heartbeat echoing in his ears. Edward stirred slightly in his sleep, murmuring something incomprehensible, but didn't wake. Brendan froze for a moment, fear of being caught mixing with the thrill of being so close. It was as if an invisible thread was about to snap. The tension in the air was nearly suffocating, but Brendan didn't pull back. He couldn't. The desire was too strong. Brendan leaned in further, his breath now brushing against Edward's skin. His lips pressed softly against his brother's shoulder, a gesture that seemed innocent, but was loaded with meaning that neither of them could yet admit. The taste of Edward's warm skin sent a shock through Brendan's senses, and he pressed another kiss, this time with more firmness, savoring the texture and the heat. He knew he was crossing a dangerous line, one he could never uncross. But he couldn't stop. Brendan ran his hand down Edward's arm, the smooth skin inviting him closer. The proximity was intoxicating. The the sensation of being so near, and yet on the brink of something unknown and forbidden making his mind whirl. Suddenly, Edward shifted again, his eyes fluttering open. Brendan froze, his heart pounding in his chest as Edward turned onto his side, now facing him. Edward's eyes were half open, still caught between sleep and wakefulness. For a moment that felt like an eternity, they stared at each other in silence, the tension in the air palpable. "Brendan?" Edward's voice was soft, husky with sleep. But there was confusion in his tone. He didn't seem fully aware of what was happening. Brendan didn't know what to say, panic beginning to mix with desire. He was about to pull away, but Edward didn't move. Instead, his eyes flicked briefly to Brendan's hand, still resting on his arm. There was something in Edward's gaze that made Brendan pause, unable to move or speak. Finally, Edward sighed lightly and closed his eyes again. Brendan remained there, paralyzed by the mixture of emotions. But something had shifted. The silence between them was different now, filled with something neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Brendan remained kneeling beside the bed, his heart racing as he watched Edward settle back into the pillow. His eyes had closed again, but the atmosphere between them was far from calm. Brendan knew that brief moment of contact had changed something. Even if Edward didn't say anything, the way he hadn't pulled away, how his body had relaxed in his presence, said more than words ever could. Brendan slowly pulled back, trying to process everything. Every beat of his heart echoed in his ears, adrenaline mixed with desire burning through his veins. He knew he should leave, let the night pass, as a secret they would never speak of. But as his eyes traced the outline of Edward's body, partially covered by the blanket, the urge to stay close was undeniable. He couldn't stop imagining what might happen if he took another step. What if Edward was aware? What if he felt the same? These questions tormented him, feeding the excitement building inside, making it impossible to back away. Brendan sat down on the floor beside the bed, close enough to feel Edward's warmth, but still caught in hesitation. He knew he couldn't continue like this. A choice had to be made, leave or risk everything. Taking a deep breath, Brendan stood up slowly, his heart racing. He took a step back, ready to return to his room. But as he turned toward the door, a low voice stopped him in his tracks. "Brendan." He froze. It was Edward, his voice still husky with sleep. But there was something different now. It wasn't just a sleepy murmur. It was a call. Brendan turned slowly, and to his surprise, Edward's eyes were open again, looking directly at him. The confusion from the first time he had woken was gone. There was something deeper in his gaze now, something that made Brendan's stomach flip. "Are you okay?" Edward asked softly, his voice calm, but filled with a curiosity Brendan didn't know how to answer. Brendan opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, unable to move forward or back. The silence stretched between them, each second heavier than the last. Edward continued to watch him, waiting for a response. Something that would explain why Brendan was standing there in the middle of the night. "I couldn't sleep," Brendan finally said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. It was a half-truth. The reason he couldn't sleep was Edward, but he couldn't say that. Not yet. Edward raised an eyebrow, as if he knew there was more to the story. He sighed softly, shifting in the bed to sit up, the sheets slipping down to his waist. Brendan felt his breath catch in his throat as he saw Edward's bare chest, glowing softly in the moonlight. "Come here," Edward said, patting the space next to him on the bed. Brendan hesitated. That simple sentence carried so much weight, a choice that could change everything. He knew that if he got closer, there would be no turning back. The invisible line between them, the one that had kept them apart, was becoming blurrier by the second. But before he could rationalize the decision, his feet moved on their own. He took a step toward the bed, his heart pounding again. Brendan sat on the edge, still distant from Edward, but close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with tension. Neither of them seemed willing to break. Finally, Edward leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Brendan's, searching for something. "You've been quiet. Is there something you want to say?" The question hung in the air, loaded with meaning. Brendan knew that Edward was giving him a chance to speak and to confess what was happening inside him. But the fear of ruining everything, of losing Edward forever, held him back from being honest. "No," Brendan murmured, breaking eye contact. Edward studied him for another moment, then gave a soft smile. "It's okay." His voice was calm, almost reassuring, but there was still a weight to it. He lay back down, closing his eyes again, as if trying to return to sleep. Brendan, however, remained seated, unable to move, his body still buzzing with conflicting emotions. The invitation was there, open but unspoken. Brendan knew that something had shifted, but it was still too early to understand what. As he watched Edward's chest rise and fall slowly, the line between them seemed to have disappeared completely, leaving only the unspoken desire they were both beginning to acknowledge. Brendan remained seated on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the silence grow between them. Edward had closed his eyes again, but the atmosphere in the room was different. There was something unspoken hanging in the air, a tension filled with possibilities, a line they had both felt, but neither had been ready to cross. Brendan's heart continued to race, and he struggled to find a way to return to normal, to pretend like nothing had happened, but he knew something had changed. It wasn't just the physical closeness. It was the weight of emotions they had both been hiding, now manifesting in ways that were subtle but undeniable. He couldn't stop looking at Edward, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, the way his hair fell slightly across his forehead. Everything about him seemed to hold a new meaning, as if Brendan were seeing him differently for the first time. Or maybe he was finally accepting what he had been feeling for so long. The silence stretched as Brendan wrestled with his own thoughts, the desire inside him growing stronger with each second. He knew that once he crossed that line, there would be no turning back. But what he had already done tonight couldn't be undone. The desire consumed him in a way that felt uncontrollable. Suddenly, Edward sighed, still with his eyes closed but shifting slightly in bed, as if sensing Brendan's presence. Brendan watched every movement, Edward's body so close, he could feel the warmth radiating from him, making the heat inside Brendan burn even hotter. "Are you still here?" Edward murmured, his voice low, laced with the exhaustion of sleep but carrying something more. Brendan hesitated before answering. "Yeah." The word came out in a whisper, almost as if admitting he was still there, made everything even more real. Edward didn't say anything for a moment, just lay there, motionless, with his eyes still closed. But then he shifted again, slowly opening his eyes to meet Brendan's gaze. The look on his face was hard to read, a mix of curiosity and something deeper that Brendan couldn't quite put his finger on. "And why are you here?" Edward asked, his voice clearer now, but with a slight tease that made Brendan even more nervous. Brendan bit his lip, unsure of how to respond. He could come up with an excuse, something to deflect the question, but deep down, he knew there was no point in lying. The weight of everything that was happening between them was too heavy to ignore, and deep down, he knew Edward felt it too. "I don't know," Brendan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, almost vulnerable. It was the simplest truth he could offer at that moment. He really didn't know why he was there, only that the desire had led him to this point. Edward watched him in silence for a moment, his eyes scanning Brendan's face. Then, without saying a word, he shifted slightly, sitting up more in bed, the blanket falling to reveal more of his bare chest. Brendan felt his breath catch in his throat at the sight. "Come here," Edward said, giving a small space next to him on the bed. Brendan hesitated. That simple phrase carried so much weight, a choice that could change everything. He knew that if he moved closer, there would be no going back. The line between them, the one that had kept them apart, was blurring with each passing second. But before he could stop himself, Brendan's body responded to the pull. He moved closer, sitting down on the bed next to Edward, their bodies close enough that Brendan could feel the heat coming off Edward's skin. The silence between them thickened, charged with a tension neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge out loud. Edward turned to face Brendan, his expression softer now, but with a quiet intensity that made Brendan's stomach churn with anticipation. "You're awfully quiet. Is there something you need to say?" Brendan's heart raced as the words hung in the air. Edward was giving him an opportunity to say something, to admit what was going on between them. But the fear of ruining everything, of losing Edward, held him back. Instead, Brendan shook his head slightly. "No," he whispered. Edward's eyes lingered on Brendan's for a moment before he smiled gently. "That's okay." He lay back down, closing his eyes again, leaving Brendan sitting there torn between the overwhelming desire and the fear of taking that final step. The room seemed to shrink around them, as if the whole world had closed in on that bed. In that moment, Brendan could feel Edward's body getting closer, the kiss between them now deeper, more intense. The heat between them was undeniable, and time seemed to stop as their bodies responded to each other with a long-suppressed urgency. Edward's fingers intertwined with Brendan's, a small gesture, but one loaded with meaning. Brendan could feel the soft but firm pressure of Edward's hand in his, a gesture that made him want more. He wanted to feel every part of Edward, to explore what they had both been denying for so long. Without breaking the kiss, Brendan moved his free hand along Edward's arm, feeling the firm muscles under the warm skin. The touch seemed to ignite something between them, and Brendan could feel Edward's body respond, his muscles tightening slightly beneath the touch. The excitement between them was undeniable, and Brendan felt the desire grow stronger with every second. Edward finally broke the kiss, his lips still just inches from Brendan's, both of them breathless, their breaths mingling in the thick air of the room. There was a glint in Edward's eyes, something between desire and a quiet, playful challenge. He didn't say anything, but the slight smile on his face made it clear he wanted more too. Brendan leaned in again, this time his lips finding Edward's neck. The taste of his warm, soft skin sent a wave of electricity through Brendan's body, and he couldn't help but let out a soft groan. Edward tilted his head to the side, allowing Brendan more access, his body relaxing under the touch. Every touch seemed to intensify what they were already feeling. Brendan's heart pounded in his chest, his body responding instinctively to Edward's touches and sighs. He wanted more. He wanted to feel Edward's body beneath his, to let that connection deepen and grow stronger. Edward shifted slightly, leaning back and pulling Brendan with him. Their bodies were now pressed so close that any remaining hesitation had melted away. The excitement between them seemed to grow with every touch, every movement. Brendan looked at Edward, and the two exchanged a look filled with unspoken meaning, neither needing to say what was happening. They both knew. Brendan's hand slid across Edward's chest, feeling the warm, firm skin beneath his fingers. He allowed himself to explore Edward's body more boldly, his fingers tracing the lines of his muscles, following every curve with the intention of drawing out the tension between them. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a soft sigh as he felt Brendan's touch roam his body. The connection between them was powerful, something that had always been there, but was only now being allowed to flourish. Brendan could feel every emotion, every beat of his own heart, as his fingers explored further, the excitement within him growing with each passing moment. He knew they were crossing a line they couldn't go back from, but at that moment, nothing mattered more than what they were experiencing together. Edward opened his eyes, pulling Brendan closer, and their lips met again, this time with undeniable urgency. The kiss was intense, filled with a passion that had been held back for so long. Brendan could feel Edward's hands exploring his body too, every touch sending waves of heat that left Brendan wanting more. They had surrendered to each other, and now the room seemed too small to contain the intensity of that moment. Brendan knew that, from this point forward, nothing would ever be the same. The intensity of what had happened between them hung in the air, even after they both lay side by side, their bodies exhausted, breathing still uneven. The silence in the room wasn't the awkward, uneasy kind that Brendan had feared. Instead, it was a comfortable silence, filled with the shared understanding of what they had just experienced. Brendan stared at the ceiling, his body relaxed, but his mind racing with thoughts of everything that had just happened. The weight of the choice they had made, that irreversible decision to cross a line, hung over Brendan. He knew from this moment on, everything would be different. But as much as he tried to find a reason to regret what they'd done, he couldn't. In fact, for the first time in a long while, Brendan felt alive. He felt whole. Beside him, Edward remained silent, his eyes closed, but Brendan knew he wasn't asleep. He could still feel the lingering touch of Edward's fingers on his skin, the warmth from his body that seemed to invite Brendan closer even now. The way Edward had responded to him was undeniable, and Brendan's mind was flooded with memories of their touches, their kisses, the way they had moved together. Brendan rolled slightly onto his side, his gaze focused on Edward, who was still lying there, his face calm, his breathing now steady. He watched Edward closely, tracing every feature, the way his hair fell softly over his forehead, how peaceful yet intense he looked. Brendan wanted to know what Edward was thinking, wanted to ask how he felt about everything, but instead, he stayed quiet, content to let the moment stretch out a little longer. "Do you think we should talk about this?" Brendan finally broke the silence, his voice quiet, unsure. He didn't know if Edward was ready to talk about what had happened, but the question hung in the air between them. Edward opened his eyes slowly, turning his head to meet Brendan's gaze. There was a calmness in his eyes, but also a depth that Brendan hadn't noticed before. He breathed in deeply before speaking. "Talk about what?" Edward asked with a small smile, as though trying to ease the tension. But Brendan knew that beneath that lightness, Edward understood exactly what he was asking. Brendan felt his stomach churn slightly. He knew there was no easy answer to what they were facing, but he needed to know what Edward thought. The night had been intense, but now they had to face the consequences of what they had chosen to do. "About us, about what happened," Brendan said, his voice more steady now. He needed to hear Edward say that this was more than just a spur of the moment, more than just a night of repressed desire. He needed to know that Edward was as invested in this as he was. Edward stayed quiet for a moment, and Brendan could see him thinking. Finally, Edward sighed softly, his expression softening. "Brendan, what happened between us wasn't just a random thing. I know that. You know that," Edward said, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I don't think we need all the answers right now. I don't even know if we have all the answers." Brendan felt a mix of relief and anxiety at Edward's words. He was right. They had crossed a line, but maybe it wasn't the right time to try to label or define exactly what that meant. Not yet. They had made a choice that would change everything, and now they needed to navigate this new territory carefully. But, at the same time, Brendan knew that what they shared was real, and for now, that was enough. Edward reached out and intertwined his fingers with Brendan's, a silent gesture, but one full of meaning. They didn't need words at that moment. The touch of their hands, the mutual understanding and the looks they exchanged, all of that spoke louder than any explanation could. The weight of the future still lingered over them, but in that moment, with Edward's warmth beside him, Brendan knew they wouldn't face it alone. The choice had been made, and now it was up to both of them to decide how to move forward. The road ahead was uncertain, but together they were willing to figure it out. Edward squeezed Brendan's hand lightly, as if to confirm what they both already knew. They were ready to face whatever came next, together. The intensity of the moment seemed to grow with each passing second. Brendan lay still, his mind flooded with thoughts of what had just happened between them. He felt a strange mix of relief, excitement, and a gnawing uncertainty about what was to come. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now they had to face the reality of it. Beside him, Edward hadn't said much since they'd shared that moment of mutual surrender. His breathing had slowed, his body relaxed beside Brendan's, but the air between them felt thick with unspoken thoughts. Brendan couldn't help but wonder what Edward was thinking, if he regretted it, if he felt the same way Brendan did. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Brendan turned onto his side to face Edward. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly, the question almost slipping out before he could stop himself. Edward opened his eyes slowly, turning his head to meet Brendan's gaze. For a moment, neither of them said anything, the weight of the question hanging between them. Then Edward shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, I don't regret it," he said quietly, "but I don't know where we go from here." Brendan nodded slowly, understanding the uncertainty in Edward's words. He didn't know either. All he knew was that what had happened between them had felt right, even if it had also been unexpected and confusing. "We'll figure it out," Brendan said, his voice steady but filled with the same uncertainty. "We don't have to have all the answers right now." Edward gave a small nod of agreement, his hand reaching out to lightly touch Brendan's arm. The touch was comforting, grounding in a way that made Brendan feel like they were in this together. No matter what came next, they would face it side by side. As they lay in the quiet of the early morning, Brendan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future was uncertain, but they had made a choice to cross that line, and now they would face whatever came next, together. The soft morning light began to filter through the curtains, gently illuminating Brendan and Edward as they lay in silence. The night had passed, but the weight of the choices they'd made and the emotions they'd shared still hung in the air like a quiet, lingering shadow. Brendan felt the calm of the moment, but he also knew that, like the rising sun, reality would soon catch up with them. They had crossed a line that could never be undone. What they had experienced together wasn't just physical, it was a connection that went far deeper, touching parts of themselves that neither had explored before. But now, in the light of day, new questions surfaced. How would they move forward? What did this mean for both of them? Brendan shifted slightly, feeling Edward's warmth beside him. The closeness now felt so natural, so right, but still laden with an unspoken tension. He turned to face Edward, who lay awake, eyes lost in thought as the weight of the night lingered. "Morning," Brendan murmured, his voice still hoarse from the night before. Edward turned his head toward him, a light smile on his lips. "Morning," he replied softly, but there was something behind his eyes, a depth that told Brendan they were both still navigating the unknown. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them felt comfortable, yet filled with anticipation. Both of them knew they had to face what came next, but what did that mean? How could they go on with their lives knowing that something so profound had shifted between them? "Do you think we can just pretend nothing happened?" Brendan finally asked, his voice more serious now, reflecting the reality that lay ahead. Edward sighed, rolling onto his side to face Brendan more fully. "I don't think we should pretend. I don't think we can," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the truth. "But I also don't think we need to figure everything out right away." Brendan nodded, feeling both relief and a hint of anxiety. Edward was right. What they had shared wasn't something that could be swept under the rug, and the thought of pretending it never happened felt unbearable. They needed to be honest, both with themselves and with each other. "So, what do we do now?" Brendan asked, feeling the uncertainty settle in. There were a million ways this could go, and he wasn't sure which path would be the best for them. Edward stayed silent for a moment, thinking before he responded. "I think the most important thing right now is that we're honest about how we feel. We don't need to have all the answers yet, but that doesn't mean we should ignore what happened, or what we feel." Brendan felt a lightness wash over him as he heard Edward's words. Edward wasn't suggesting they hide or deny what they had shared. They could take it one step at a time, without rushing to label or define everything right away. But what mattered was that they were in this together. "I agree," Brendan said softly, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He still didn't know what the future held for them, but knowing that Edward was by his side, ready to face it with him, was enough for now. Edward moved closer, his fingers finding Brendan.